In 1931, Universal Studios, struggling with heavy losses during the early years of the Great Depression, struck gold with their release of Dracula in February, a movie that would earn nearly $750,000 in profit for the studio. The head of production at the time, Carl Laemmle Jr., immediately began pushing for more horror films. Hoping for lightning to strike twice, Jr. Laemmle secured the rights to a recent British stage production of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. An American rewrite had been prepared by John L. Balderston for a run in New York. Enter James Whale. There are two different versions of how Whale became attached to Frankenstein. According to studio history, Whale was given 50 potential scripts to work on, and he enthusiastically picked Frankenstein because he wanted to see if he could make the unbelievable believable and get away from being typecast as a director of war pictures. According to Whale, however, he was, quote, forced more or less against his will, unquote, but quickly became intrigued by the thematic possibilities of Shelley's original novel. The movie released in November of 1931 to critical acclaim and commercial success. Against a total budget of just under $300,000, it earned $1.4 million in theater rentals, which amounted to over $700,000 in total profit for the studio. Karloff became an overnight superstar, and James Whale would become something of a household name in horror.
The Bride of Frankenstein.
Dr. Frankenstein and his homicidal monster have both survived the fiery incident at the windmill, and as the hungry monster roams across the countryside, Frankenstein recovers in the care of his darling Elizabeth. They are visited by one Dr. Pretorius, who entices Frankenstein with forbidden knowledge that could help him succeed where he had once failed. Frankenstein refuses, however, and leaves to get married. Later, the monster finds a friend in the twisted Dr. Pretorius, who convinces the increasingly intelligent brute that, with the help of Dr. Frankenstein, the monster could be given an undead bride of his very own.
Before we go any further, if you could please hit that like button, maybe I'll finally be accepted by the village. If you really do like this video, please subscribe as well. Thank you in advance. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. Director James Whale didn't want to make a sequel to Frankenstein. Jr. Laemmle, who was starting to lose influence at Universal, was insistent, however, and roared ahead, promoting the then-titled Return of Frankenstein, even listing the reluctant Whale as director. Many different scripts were written, including some truly outlandish ones containing such plot devices as a traveling carnival and a death ray. Eventually, though, Laemmle got enough leverage to force Whale to accept the job, after which Whale rejected the various drafts. To write a new script he felt he could work with, Whale hired John L. Balderston, the man who had written the stage plays that inspired both Frankenstein and Dracula, and who had also written Universal's The Mummy. After 3 months of work, though, Balderston was taken off the project and replaced by frequent Whale collaborator R.C. Sheriff, who, after a few weeks, was replaced by Edmund Pearson and William Hurlbut. All of these writers worked with ideas from Whale, and eventually, Whale stitched together bits and pieces of each draft and made his own Frankenstein's monster of a script, which he insisted on calling The Bride of Frankenstein, a title he knew didn't make a lot of sense. This script, a messy collection of mangled, mismatched pages that was credited solely to Hurlbut, was then sent to the Production Code Administration for approval. I've talked about the PCA before, but as a brief explanation for newcomers to the channel, the administration traced its origins to the late 20s, when the film industry was under threat of eager legislators within the US government. The Hays Code was, essentially, a set of standards to ensure a film wouldn't be deemed offensive or problematic, which the PCA began enforcing on all Hollywood productions by 1934, the dawn of what film historians call the Code Era. At its height, the PCA was, in effect, a censorship board, and even though Whale was able to maintain a relatively unheard-of level of creative control over his Frankenstein sequel, with Laemmle and Universal choosing to interfere as little as possible, the PCA suggested, requested, and eventually required significant edits to the script and film. James Whale's initial lack of enthusiasm didn't stop him from fighting tooth and nail to maintain his vision, a vision he grew singularly invested in. Indeed, by the time filming began, Whale, able to find clever ways around the PCA's mandated edits, was completely energized by the project, due in no small part to his freedom to do things his own way. In many regards, his journey toward making a sequel to Frankenstein was very similar to the journey of Frankenstein himself, pulled reluctantly back into the drama only to find himself in love with its potential. Boris Karloff, now billed as just Karloff, was of course back as the monster, despite the strained relationship he had with James Whale. Karloff didn't particularly like the script, resistant to its more comedic tone and arguing that it was silly to have the monster speak. As always, though, he was a consummate professional, and he put forward arguably the greatest single performance of his entire career. This time around, things were a bit easier for the actor. There were fewer physical demands put on him, and the makeup by Jack Pierce was a bit easier to apply, as the tedious building up of the head by cotton and collodion was replaced by a much simpler rubber headpiece. Colin Clive returned as Frankenstein, though his part was pared down due to his chronic alcoholism. The Bride of Frankenstein would be one of his final major performances too, as he died from tuberculosis exacerbated by the alcoholism in 1937. Mae Clarke, who had played Frankenstein's fiancée Elizabeth in the original Frankenstein, couldn't reprise the role for health reasons, possibly related to a 1933 car accident. Instead, Elizabeth, who over the course of the film becomes the actual Bride of Frankenstein, is played by a 17-year-old Valerie Hobson. Popular character actor Dwight Frye was able to return, however. Even though his character, Fritz, was killed off in the original film, Whale was eager to have the actor back, and so had written into the plot the character of Carl, who is practically the same person minus the hunchback. Interestingly, some of the crazier early drafts had Frankenstein resurrect Fritz, though this plot point thankfully never made it into Whale's film. The critical role of Dr. Pretorius was written for Claude Rains, to whom Whale had given the starring role in The Invisible Man. Why Rains didn't get the part is a matter of much speculation, with some reports claiming James Whale didn't want him for the part, but the more likely explanation being that Rains wasn't interested in genre pictures at that point in his career. Regardless of the reason, Whale turned to his wildly eccentric friend Ernest Thesiger, who had previously appeared in Whale's The Old Dark House with Charles Laughton and Boris Karloff. There's also a lot of contention about the dual casting of the monster's bride and Mary Shelley, ignoring for the moment how anachronistic it is for the character not to be credited as Mary Godwin in the cast list. Press releases at the time insisted there had been an enormous hunt for the perfect actress, with consideration reportedly given to the likes of up-and-comer Phyllis Brooks and Metropolis's Bridget Helm. However, as early as the John Balderston scripts, Elsa Lanchester, the wife of Charles Laughton, was identified as the actress Whale wanted. At one point, Whale was so determined to cast her in both roles, he threatened to quit if the studio refused. So, I find it hard to believe anyone else was ever really in the running. Lanchester is incredible in both roles, even though she only has about 10 total minutes of screen time. For the bride, she mimicked the twitchy behavior of swans she encountered at Regent's Park in London, the behavior of which also inspired the famous hiss. Other actors worth noting are the Invisible Man's Una O'Connor and E.E. Clive as Frankenstein's maid Minnie and the Burgomeister, respectively, the young Marilyn Harris, who had played poor Maria in the original film and who gets an uncredited cameo here, and John Carradine as the hunter who interrupts the monster in The Hermit. As for that Hermit, Whale was so adamant to have Australia-born stage actor O.P. Heggie that he shut down production for 10 days to accommodate the actor's busy schedule. This was such a radical and risky move at the time that any other director under any other circumstances would probably have been fired for it. Filming took place between January and March of 1935, with a few reshoots done to accommodate the PCA censors and Whale's own whims. A relatively large subplot involving Dwight Frye's Carl killing his aunt and uncle and framing the monster for it was replaced by this gypsy scene, and after previous screenings, Whale decided to refilm part of the ending to allow Frankenstein and Elizabeth to survive. The two characters were originally destined to perish in the final scene, alongside everyone else, but Whale changed their fates at the last possible moment before the film's release. If you look carefully, you can still see Frankenstein in the climactic explosion. The photographic effects, especially Pretorius's creations, were overseen by the great John P. Fulton, who had worked on both Frankenstein and The Invisible Man, and who would later win multiple Academy Awards for his work, most memorably for the Ten Commandments. However, even Fulton's work is overshadowed by composer Franz Waxman's now famous score.
Music?
Building off the groundbreaking precedent of Max Steiner's work on King Kong just 2 years earlier, Waxman, who Whale hired at a party, created open-ended leitmotifs for each central character that are intricately woven together throughout the film. While it's not my favorite classic film score, I do respect the complexity and beauty of what Waxman created, and how it elevates the film to even greater heights not possible prior to Steiner's reinvention of movie music. The Bride of Frankenstein released in April of 1935 to mostly positive reviews that tended to applaud the film while derisively dismissing its genre. However, it was a massive success for Universal, earning as much as $2 million in theater rentals against a budget of just under $400,000. Junior Lemley earned a short-lived boost to his career at Universal, and the film began the trend of nearly all Universal classic monsters getting sequels in the years to come. Today, it is considered by critics and fans alike as perhaps the best of all the Universal classic monster films, even surpassing the original Frankenstein in terms of cultural staying power. Even just the bride herself, only shown for a few moments on screen, has become one of the most iconic monsters in a stable of iconic monsters, and attempts to revive her are too numerous to list here, though I will give a shout out to the bombastic Branagh version of Frankenstein that has a particularly grisly interpretation of the bride in its final act. A new remake has gone through various phases of development in recent years, with David Coep writing the screenplay and with Angelina Jolie and Scarlett Johansson both attached at different points, but as of March of this year, 2022, Coep himself has said it is no longer happening. As I'm fond of saying on this channel, I'm not opposed to remakes on principle, and for the record, I do wish Universal could get its act together and make a new universe of good films around their classic horror properties. However, I don't really see an angle for a new Bride of Frankenstein just yet, so the burden of proof is on Universal to justify it and prove they can do it justice, a tough bar to clear given their recent track record. I've gotten into trouble in the past for saying that I prefer the original Frankenstein to its well-regarded sequel, and I can understand why. Gun to my head though, I probably still feel the same way, but I have given a lot of thought to why that is. I think it all comes down to the camp, specifically the character of Dr. Pretorius, who is just too silly to take seriously. I really don't like that scene where he trots out his little people creations, which asks far too much from my suspension of disbelief. I also vacillate wildly between loving Una O'Connor's Minnie and not being able to tolerate her nails on a chalkboard screeching. For the most part, though, the majority of the things I don't love about the movie are confined to its first act, and by the time it focuses more on the monster and the build-up to the big reveal of the bride, I'm 100% on board. Maybe if Pretorius had been played by Claude Rains, I wouldn't be so contrary. I will say, The Bride of Frankenstein, with its incredible music, bold directing, expressionist set design, and moody cinematography, is the better-made film, and my preference for its predecessor only comes out of personal taste. I don't hate mixing comedy and horror, but I do believe that horror is more powerful when it takes itself seriously, something this movie refuses to do. The exception to this, though, is the entire sequence with the blind hermit, which plays out without a trace of self-mockery. If I were to pit the whole of the original Frankenstein against just that 15 or so minutes of Bride, the latter would definitely win out. I just feel like the rest of the film doesn't completely live up to it, mostly because of the more comedic tone. Again though, this is just my personal opinion. Feel free to berate me in the comments for it. While we're stopped, let me just take a minute to thank my patrons. Their support really makes this channel possible, so please, if you like these videos, consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. You can also give me a one-time contribution by clicking on the thanks button below. Also, if you want even more content from me, I'm the co-host of a couple of different podcasts, The Streaming Heap and From Here to Paternity, which are available wherever you get your podcasts, and I have a novel called Paradox that is available through Amazon. If all else fails, though, you can always check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more sci-fi classics in both film and literature. Now then, with all that shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's move on. Setting aside my problematic personal preferences, what is The Bride of Frankenstein really about? On one hand, it is a natural evolution of the characters, from Frankenstein himself being tempted and eventually forced to recommit his greatest sin, to the monster, who rapidly grows from a mute child to some semblance of sexual maturity, even passing through the angsty teenager phase along the way.
I love dead, hate living.
You're wise in your generation.
In the end, Frankenstein is allowed to run away from the horror he has wrought as his monster learns to forgive him. The film, though, is about far more than just the characters and trying to resolve their statuses from the previous film. In the last few decades, for example, the film has gained a reputation for having a so-called queer subtext, no doubt due to the open homosexuality of director James Whale and actor Ernest Thesiger. Many academics and film historians I've read on the matter seem a little too eager to dismiss this as a thematic through-line, because I do think there's at least some merit to this reading of the film. The basic idea is that the monster, looking for a way to fit in with normal people, believes he can find his salvation in a female mate, but ultimately learns that this won't work for him. It's no stretch to say that Whale understood the isolation of a gay lifestyle and imbued into the monster his own youthful experiences of being at the receiving end of hatred and prejudice. Thus, I do believe the queer subtext is real and valid. Heck, in the shooting script, there is even a line from Dr. Pretorius that confirms the character is gay, though this line was cut, probably at the urging of the Production Code Administration. However, I do think the themes are more broad, and that rather than just being about homosexuality, The Bride of Frankenstein is about being an outsider in general. A lot of the different motifs meld together here, but the clearest way to approach it is from the religious angle, such as the ironic inversion of the resurrected monster being crucified. One scene that the censors simply wouldn't allow was one in which the monster, while trying to escape through the graveyard, comes across a statue of Christ on the cross. Thinking that Christ is a real person who has been treated the way he had been treated, the monster tears down the cross and tries to free the crucified figure before realizing he is just a statue. Whale did retain the statue in the final film, even if he wasn't able to use it the way he wanted, and as cheeky retaliation for the censorship, he instead had the monster push down and destroy a statue of a bishop, which is probably more blasphemous than the original scene would have been. There's more religious overtones as well, especially surrounding the hermit sequence, where the blind man not only admits to praying for a friend while a crucifix hangs in the frame, but he also shows the monster how to distinguish good from bad.
There is good, and there is bad. Good, bad.
Not to mention how to take communion with bread and wine. This isn't to say The Bride of Frankenstein is specifically a religious text, because I don't believe it is, nor do I believe that Whale, an avowed atheist, intended it to be one. Instead, it is merely using Christianity to show the importance of empathy, compassion, and humility, characteristics embodied by the hermit, lacking in the fearful mob, and outright rejected by the Faustian Dr. Pretorius, who happily compares himself to the devil. There's also a strong feminist subtext to be found in the film, from the opening scene where the men express profound disbelief that a seemingly delicate and beautiful woman like Mary could contain within her mind the macabre world of Frankenstein and his monster, to the ultimate reveal of the bride, who is treated as a thing to be possessed, before she is even given the spark of life. Even her name, the Bride, is dehumanizing. Not that the monster is particularly flattering either. Regardless of how you choose to see it, though, Whale himself intended for there to be no resolution to the moral and social problems of the text. Therefore, I find it difficult to boil it all down to one easily expressed theme. If you want to be trite about it, I guess you could argue for looks can be deceiving, and say the film is merely showing that we all contain multitudes and shouldn't be judged by stereotypes. For me, though, I would just say this: whether worshipped or persecuted, we are each capable of being both good and evil, because deep down, we are all both gods and monsters.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
And that's all for today, my fellow mortals. Which Frankenstein movie do you prefer? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll explore the global dangers of online gaming, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
This is wood for the fire. Wood.